40 years ago, aviation would see its second deadliest year. 1985 would see numerous horrific crashes that would be due to a wide variety of causes, ranging from bad weather, pilot error, improper maintenance, bombings, hijackers, and causes unknown. The carnage would be spread all around the world. This year would bring the nations of Japan, Canada, and the Soviet Union their deadliest air disasters, not to mention some of the deadliest disasters in all of aviation history. Today, we will look at the year of 1985 in aviation and the disasters that made it one of the worst years in its history, behind only the year of 1972. This video will focus solely on fatal air crashes. I will not be doing an exhaustive breakdown of every fatal air accident in 1985. I will be generally excluding cases involving fewer than 10 fatalities, as well as cases with very limited info, with a few exceptions. This video will go through each month from January to December, detailing and examining the most notable cases from each month. Given a year of this nature, such an examination will take quite a while, though, as we will soon see, one of the year's most interesting cases would occur mere hours into the new year. Eastern Airlines Flight 980 would depart Asunción, Paraguay at 6:57 p.m. local time on January 1st. The 3-year-old Boeing 727-200 was headed for Miami with stopovers in La Paz and Guayaquil. 10 crew and 19 passengers were aboard the flight. Among the passengers were Marion Davis, wife of Arthur Davis, the U.S. ambassador to Paraguay, and William Kelly, director of the Peace Corps in the same country. The aircraft was flown by Captain Lawrence Campbell, First Officer Kenneth Rhodes, and Flight Engineer Mark Bird. The flight crew was joined by Czech pilot Joseph Lozeth Jr. By 7:46 p.m., Flight 980 had entered Bolivian airspace at 35,000 feet and made contact with controllers in Santa Cruz. The aircraft would remain in contact with controllers there until 8:25 p.m., when the aircraft was passed over to ATC in La Paz's El Alto Airport, where Flight 980 intended to land. Upon contacting controllers there, the pilots requested permission to begin descending. It should be noted that La Paz is located about 13,000 feet above sea level and partially surrounded by mountains, the highest of which being Mount El Amani, with a summit almost 21,000 feet high. La Paz is such an unusual airport that pilots require a special qualification to land there. Captain Campbell lacked this qualification, which is why Czech Captain Lozeth, who did have this qualification, was aboard the flight. The aircraft was cleared to descend to 25,000 feet at 8:26. At 8:37, the crew reported over Dakon, a reporting point southeast of La Paz. A minute later, the crew was cleared to descend to 18,000 feet and report when they were within 20 miles of El Alto Airport. The crew would acknowledge this request.
Too low, terrain.
Nothing more would be heard from Flight 980. The aircraft was expected to make its next report around 8:47. After various attempts to reach the aircraft, Eastern 980 was assumed to have crashed and search and rescue operations were prepared. Weather was poor at the time. According to the Bolivian report, search and rescue operations were impossible to carry out until January 3rd. That day, searchers located the wreck of the jet. The plane had slammed into Mount El Amani at around 19,600 feet. The estimated time of impact was at 8:40, around 2 minutes after last contact. All 29 on board were killed. The case of Flight 980 has been the source of much controversy in the years since. No cause for the disaster was ever found. The location of the wreck made investigation difficult. Besides being near the top of a 21,000-foot-tall mountain, the site would soon be covered in a thick layer of snow. Judging by footage of the site, the snow depth would best be measured in feet or meters. Perhaps because of this, neither flight recorder or any human remains were found. The location of the wreck is the primary mystery of this disaster. Upon reaching Dakon, the aircraft would have been flying on a course of 314 degrees, navigating via the La Paz VOR. After reaching Dakon, the aircraft would continue on this course. Instead, however, the aircraft made a 26-degree right-hand turn. No concrete explanation could be found for this turn. It was suggested that this may have been done to avoid weather, but no request to do so was made on the radio. If this was the case, then this turn was completely unauthorized by controllers, which is highly unusual. Alternatively, NTSB investigation of the La Paz VOR would find that it was in poor condition, with the distance measuring function of the device being out of service since November. The directional component of the VOR still appears to have been working properly. The 727's Omega navigation system was scrutinized, but nothing could be found that would indicate a failure of this device had caused the accident. The Bolivian Ministry of Aeronautics would claim that the site was impossible to reach. Despite this, at least 5 expeditions have reached the site since the crash. An expedition by Ramon Valdez, an Eastern Airlines flight engineer, would occur sometime shortly after the crash. The expedition would be filmed with the intention of raising money for the relatives of those on board. The film demonstrates the difficulty of searching the site, with most of the wreckage seemingly buried deep in the snow.
Finally, at the top, the wind gusts to 40 miles per hour. At this altitude, the body needs more oxygen, but the cold makes it impossible to breathe deeply without damaging your lungs. Every step is painful.
Still, the expedition was able to locate the cockpit area, showing a series of mostly intact maps. In October of 1985, the NTSB sent a team to Mount Illimani to investigate the site. The expedition leader, Greg Feith, had consulted with Judith Kelly, wife of William Kelly, prior to the expedition. She had successfully reached the site earlier that year to pay her respects. The NTSB expedition was cash-strapped as the Bolivian economy was too volatile for credit cards to be viable, and the expedition was scheduled to start 3 working days after Feith was first informed of the plan. Feith had applied to receive a significant sum of money from the US government, however this required several weeks of advance notice, and thus he was only able to receive $600. A 6-man team of investigators would attempt to reach the site starting on October 8th, led by Bernardo Goracci, a local climber who had previously reached the crash site. The Red Cross would fail to provide necessary assistance as previously arranged, hampering the expedition. Sickness and injury would prevent most of the team from reaching the wreck. Feith and the other team members who weren't forced to turn back found the rear section of the aircraft where the recordings should have been located. After digging through 7 feet of snow, the aft air stair was located, near where the recorders were installed on the aircraft. Feith was unable to locate the recorders here. It is unclear if he found the area in which they should have been located, only for them to be absent, or if he had only been able to locate the general area but was unable to confirm the presence or absence of the recordings. The remaining team members were forced to begin their descent before finding anything useful to the case due to encroaching darkness and bad weather, compounded by the poor condition of the team. While searching the wreck, both Feith and Valdez would locate numerous reptile skins among the wreckage. Reportedly, these were being illegally smuggled aboard the aircraft.
Clothing is scattered about. The aircraft carried a large cargo of serpent skins for making shoes. They can be found everywhere. We searched the area by inserting a long rod into the snow. Whenever resistance was met, the digging began. At times, we would push the rod down and it would come back up. We discovered that the serpent skins had a sponge effect that would push the rod back up.
Eastern was in serious financial difficulty at this point in their history. On January 1st, 1985, the airline announced its intention to extend its wage give-back program as the airline could no longer afford to pay its employees' salaries. Later in 1985, Eastern ground crew members would be caught smuggling cocaine from Colombia using Eastern aircraft, leading to the company receiving a $1.3 million fine. The smuggling angle has led to allegations of a cover-up from some parties. In 2016, 2 men from Massachusetts would set off on their own expedition. Dan Futrell and Isaac Stoner first learned of the case when they read about it on Wikipedia's list of aircraft accidents involving unrecovered flight recorders. Eastern 980 stood out as, unlike most of the other cases, the wreck had been located, was on land, and had nevertheless been declared inaccessible. The pair would thus be inspired to launch their own expedition. Debris from the aircraft had slid down the mountain in the decades since the crash. Futrell and Stoner would find parts that seemed to belong to the aircraft's reporters and return them to the United States. Later investigation by the NTSB would determine that these parts belonged to components adjacent to the flight reporters, not the reporters themselves. A roll of magnetic tape found nearby was found to contain a recording of a TV show, not data from the aircraft. As far as I'm aware, this is the most recent update related to the case. As a part of creating this video, I attempted to recreate this flight in X-Plane 11. The video seen on the screen right now is a product of this effort. It took an unexpected amount of effort, as for some reason the pressurization system suddenly decided that it felt no reason to operate for reasons I can't figure out. After several aborted flights, I fixed the issue by switching the pressurization system to manual and twiddling the switch until the cabin altitude lowered to a survivable level. Once I was able to perform a successful flight, I could finally get some useful information. Sunset occurred shortly after entering Bolivia, and night had fully arrived well before I started the approach into La Paz. The greatest mystery of this case in my mind is the turn made at Dakar. There was no reason to turn 26 degrees upon reaching this point, as the airport is straight ahead, and this turn brings the aircraft dangerously close to terrain. Speaking of which, it is surprisingly difficult to fly an aircraft into Mount El Amani from Dakar. I needed multiple attempts to recreate the crash with a decent amount of accuracy. These misses were either due to a shallow descent rate or passing to the side of the mountain, something that will occur if the turn is delayed even slightly, or if the heading is off by a few degrees. Based on the results of my own attempts to deliberately fly an aircraft into the mountain, the crew seemed to have been remarkably unlucky crashing into it by accident. In order to reproduce the accident, the 26-degree turn needed to be made immediately upon reaching Dakar, as well as a descent rate at 1,500 feet per minute, down towards 18,000 feet. The possibility of some catastrophic failure causing the turn towards Mount El Amani seems highly unlikely. The flight path taken after the turn would have to have been straight, and a descent rate of 1,500 feet per minute is perfectly safe and normal. The final minutes of the flight are best explained by a perfectly functional aircraft being flown by a qualified pilot. This makes the turn even more confusing. A turn this large must have been noticed, if not knowingly commanded by the crew. Yet none of the four pilots, including Captain Loseth, who was specifically on board to oversee the approach into La Paz, seem to have noticed that they were violating the approach procedure and making a turn that was unauthorized by, unknown to, and almost certainly unmonitored by controllers in La Paz, as the high terrain and general disarray of the airport makes it unlikely that the aircraft was being closely monitored on radar, assuming it was on any radar screen at all. The VOR, which the crew were using to navigate to La Paz, was partially disabled. While this might seem to explain the crash, the part of the VOR that was disabled was responsible for giving distance information to aircraft, which likely played no role in the crash. Not the directional component, the failure of which would potentially explain the crash. This had been tested after the accident, and no issues could be found. One factor that may have prevented the crew from realizing the aircraft's dangerous course was the weather. While visibility was good, weather was stormy, and a cloud layer was noted around 2,100 meters above ground in La Paz at 9 p.m. This would place a layer of altostratus clouds at around 20,000 feet. The aircraft crashed at a level of 19,600 feet, meaning that if the crew's view of the mountain was obscured by clouds, they would have only been able to see it mere seconds before crashing into the mountain. I also noticed that the GPWS only activated seconds before impact, far too late for any sort of terrain escape maneuver to be executed.
Too low terrain.
This would also occur in one of the failed crashes.
Too low terrain.
I am unsure if the accident aircraft was fitted with a GPWS. This occurred on less steep terrain, better matching the actual crash site as seen on film. The disappearance of the flight recorders is certainly unusual, but given the depth of the snow, initial small poorly equipped expeditions, and general hostility of the area, this can be explained without a government cover-up. As we will soon see, this is hardly the deadliest aviation disaster to occur this year, though it is certainly one of the strangest and most unusual. On January 18th, CAAC Flight 5109 would leave Shanghai for the Chinese capital of Beijing. The AN-24 would make 2 stops prior to reaching Beijing. The first stop at Nanjing was uneventful. The aircraft would take off from there with 41 passengers and crew on board, headed for Jinan. Upon reaching Jinan, weather was poor, with fog being present and poor visibility, just above the minimum visibility of 1 kilometer. The aircraft would be assisted in landing by a pair of searchlights mounted on trucks, suggesting that infrastructure at the airport was limited, possibly not including a functional ILS. Despite this, it is claimed that the aircraft made an instrument landing from the north, using an NDB approach. What happened next is somewhat contradictory. Either the aircraft landed far down the runway and overran, or stalled while attempting a go-around. In this second narrative, the go-around was caused due to inattentiveness by the crew and the landing lights obscuring the pilot's view of the runway. The end result was the same. The aircraft crashed, killing all but 3 on board the aircraft. According to the Bureau of Aircraft Accidents Archives, the survivors were 3 passengers, while the Aviation Safety Network claims that 2 passengers and a flight attendant survived. The accident would be blamed on a combination of poor crew coordination, excessive flap extension by the pilots, bad weather, improper use of landing lights and fog, hesitation to initiate a go-around, ATC failures, and poor airport navigation aids, apparently an issue across the whole of China. The next fatal airliner crash of January would occur a day later in the island nation of Cuba. An Ilyushin IL-18 belonging to Cubana would depart the capital city of Havana at 8:22 a.m. The aircraft was carrying 33 passengers to Managua, Nicaragua. Just after takeoff, the pilots would initiate a right-hand turn. At this point, the aircraft apparently became uncontrollable. The aircraft banked to the right and left before crashing into a road near a town on the outskirts of Havana, killing all 38 passengers and crew on board. An investigation of the accident would fail to discover a cause. The 3 theories that were considered most credible were a failure of an artificial horizon, causing pilot disorientation, shifting cargo altering the aircraft's center of gravity and rendering it uncontrollable, or a failure of the aileron controls, possibly caused by shifting cargo. In the dying hours of January 20th, Galaxy Airlines Flight 202 would land at Reno, Nevada, completing a charter flight carrying football fans back home after attending the 1985 Super Bowl in Oakland, California. The 25-year-old Lockheed L-188 Electra was flying a busy schedule, having departed Seattle 5 hours late. The aircraft was tasked with flying to Oakland, Reno, and Minneapolis, then returning to Seattle before 7 o'clock in the morning. With the Oakland to Reno leg completed, the aircraft was prepared to perform Flight 203, headed to Minneapolis. The flight crew, consisting of Captain Alan Heasley, First Officer Kevin Fieldsa, and Flight Engineer Mark Friels, had been rushing to get the aircraft back on schedule, skipping various briefings and pre-flight checks. Shortly before 1 a.m. on the 21st, the crew were ready to start the Electra's 4 Allison turboprop engines. In order to accomplish this, an air start cart was brought over and connected to the aircraft via a hose, which would be connected to the air start access door. Engines 1 and 4 were successfully started before an unwelcome delay would occur. One of the ground handlers, tasked with handling the air start hose, was unable to disconnect it. An emergency stop order was given to the pilots as the ground crew fixed the issue. This would be quickly accomplished, and the aircraft would be taxiing to runway 16 right by the time the clock struck 1 a.m. At 1:01 and 32 seconds, First Officer Fieldsa would request takeoff clearance, and at 1:02 and 44 seconds, the engines would be brought up to takeoff power. At 1:03 and 1 second, as the airliner thundered down the runway, a rattling sound could be heard on the CVR. 18 seconds later, the first officer would make the routine V1 callout, indicating that the aircraft was traveling too fast to safely abort takeoff. Almost simultaneously, a loud thunking sound was heard. 4 seconds later, the aircraft reached rotation speed. As Captain Heasley brought the aircraft into the air, a second thunk was heard. At 1:03 and 26 seconds, the captain called for gear up, then asked the flight engineer what the noise was, to which he had no answer. Around this time, a heavy vibration was noticed by the crew. Flight engineer Friels would report that he had brought the engines down from takeoff power to climb power at 1:03 and 37 seconds. The captain directed him to reduce power even further, believing that the noises and vibrations were caused by an issue with one of the engines. The captain then told the first officer to request a return to the airport. As Fieldza carried out this order at 1:03 and 50 seconds, Friels noted that nothing appeared to be wrong with the engines. The captain did not understand the significance of this report from the flight engineer, being too focused on flying the aircraft and directing the first officer to make further reports to the controllers in Reno. At 1:04 and 5 seconds, the aircraft would begin to suffer from buffeting, indicating that the aircraft was becoming dangerously close to stall speed. An order was given to apply power 6 seconds later. GPWS alerts could be heard at 1:04 and 14 seconds, while the first officer called out the aircraft's slow speed shortly afterwards. At 1:04 and 24 seconds, the captain called for maximum power. A second later, the flight engineer confirmed the order. These were the last words heard on the CVR, as the aircraft struck the ground at 1:04 and 30 seconds. The aircraft crashed into a field before plowing into a sales lot for an RV dealership and bursting into flames. By the time rescuers were able to reach the wreck, only 3 of the 71 occupants aboard the aircraft had survived. One of the survivors would pass away on January 29th, while another would succumb on February 4th. The sole survivor was 17-year-old George Lampson Jr., who was traveling with his father, one of the initial survivors. When later interviewed by the NTSB, he would state that someone had made an address on the PA system prior to impact, telling the passengers that the plane was about to crash. He had covered his face with his arms and pulled his legs up. On impact, his seat was propelled through a bulkhead, landing 40 feet ahead of the nose on a highway. After landing, Lampson was able to undo his seatbelt and ran away from the wreck. All 3 initial survivors had been thrown from the wreck in this manner, but Lampson's curled-up position prior to impact had prevented him from sustaining fatal injuries. Initial speculation would point to the shedding of a propeller blade as the cause of the crash, but this would quickly be disproven. The investigation would confirm the flight engineer's report regarding the engines prior to the crash. No technical failure had occurred. The noises and vibrations had been caused by the air start access door, which had been left open by the ground crew while starting the engines. The ground crew members responsible for performing this procedure had little experience with the Electra, and their supervisor had never previously been involved in the servicing of one. There had been previous cases of this door being left open, but none had caused a crash. The open door alone did not bring down Flight 203. The primary cause of the accident was the captain's misdiagnosis of the problem. Immediately after takeoff, he called for engine power to be reduced, indicating that he believed something was wrong with the engines. After power was brought down, the pilots became distracted with trying to arrange a return to the airport. Neither of the pilots appear to have heard the flight engineer's report that the engines were operating correctly. As the pilots communicated with the ground, the aircraft slowed down until reaching stall speed. The aircraft was too low to be saved once it had begun to descend. The stall buffeting may have been masked by the vibrations caused by the open door, delaying the crew's reaction. The NTSB would primarily blame the pilots for failing to monitor the aircraft's speed, with the failure of the ground crew to close the air start door being considered a contributing factor. A day after the crash of Galaxy Airlines Flight 203, a C-130 Hercules belonging to the 440th Tactical Airlift Wing of the U.S. Air Force would depart Howard Air Force Base in Panama for Honduras. The aircraft was carrying 5 crew and 16 passengers to partake in Big Pine 3, a joint U.S.-Honduran military exercise scheduled to start in a few weeks. The aircraft's first stop would be made in Trujillo, located on the northern coast of Honduras. As the aircraft approached the airport around 9:30 in the morning, weather was marginal with a visibility of 2.5 kilometers, a ceiling of 1,500 feet, and a 25-knot wind blowing in from the north. While making a left turn, the aircraft would descend too low, causing the left wing to strike the water. The aircraft would crash 13 kilometers northwest of the airport, just off Puerto Castilla, killing all on board. At the time, the ongoing conflict in neighboring Nicaragua had been crossing the border into Honduras. There was initial speculation that the aircraft may have been shot down. This was quickly dismissed as Trujillo was far away from the conflict area and bad weather seemed a far more credible cause. Indeed, the weather was so poor that searchers were unable to locate the wreck on the 22nd. It wouldn't be until the following day that the USS McCloy would locate the aircraft's wreck using sonar. However, the attention of the aviation world would drift away from Honduras by this point, as January 23rd would be one of the most chaotic days of 1985. The 23rd of January was a rainy, foggy day in western Colombia. Despite this, two small passenger planes intended to complete their scheduled flights. Aries Colombia Flight 585, flown by an Embraer EMB-110 Banderante, was making its way from Florencia to Cali, with a stop in Neiva. The aircraft departed Neiva with 15 passengers and 2 crew members on board at 9:35 a.m. As the Banderante made its way to Cali, ACE's Flight 052 departed Quibdó for Medellin at 10:10 a.m. The de Havilland Canada Twin Otter was carrying 21 passengers and 2 crew. Both flights would encounter fog and rain en route. Despite this, the pilots of both aircraft flew under visual flight rules, which required far greater visibility than the weather afforded to them on this day. Sometime prior to 10:30, Flight 585 began its approach into Cali after reporting over Tuluá at 10,500 feet. Pilots were cleared to begin their descent. Nothing more would be heard from the plane. Around 5 minutes later, Flight 052 would go missing while cruising at 11,500 feet. Searches for both aircraft would commence, and both wrecks were found within a day. All 40 occupants of both aircraft had died when the aircraft crashed into mountainous terrain. Flight 585 is believed to have crashed around 10:30, while Flight 052 crashed around 5 minutes later at 10:35. Flight 585 had crashed at the 8,600-foot level of a mountain 30 kilometers south of Tuluá, while Flight 052 had crashed in a remote mountainous region about halfway to Medellin. The cause of both accidents was the same. Both crews had negligently continued flying under VFR in instrument meteorological conditions, while flying at a relatively low altitude, and descending in the case of Flight 585 in a mountainous area, leading to a controlled flight into terrain. On the the same day that two airliners crashed in Colombia, a Boeing 727 belonging to LAB would depart La Paz, Bolivia, with 127 people on board. As the aircraft approached its destination of Santa Cruz, it would begin to descend. While passing through 10,000 feet, the jet was rocked by an explosion. The damage done to the aircraft was not severe enough to destroy it, and the pilots were able to make an emergency landing at Santa Cruz.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
It would later be determined that the explosion was caused by a bomb that had been set off in the forward lavatory by a passenger who was the only fatality. Very little information is available on this case. It would appear as though this bomber was quite incompetent. The bomber waited until the aircraft was well into its descent when the bomb would have been less effective. Indeed, the damage was so minor that the aircraft involved was repaired and continued to serve LAB until 2007. No motive is given for the bomber's actions. The chaos in South America would overshadow an unfolding mystery in the Pacific. At some point during the 23rd, a U.S. Navy VA-3 Sky Warrior would depart Naval Air Facility Atsugi, located on the outskirts of Tokyo, headed for Guam. The aircraft involved was apparently a one-off modification of the A-3, designed to carry VIPs. At the time of the flight, it was serving Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron VQ-1. The Sky Warrior was occasionally tasked with transporting the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, though not on this occasion. On the 23rd, the aircraft was flown by 3 crew members with 6 passengers on board. Among their number was Commander John Mitchell, VQ-1's commanding officer. At some point during the flight, the reconnaissance plane would go missing. Multiple sources indicate that this occurred around 200 kilometers northwest of Guam. By the following day, major sea and air searches were underway, but despite this, no trace of the aircraft was ever found. The leading theory for the cause of the disappearance is some sort of serious engine failure, though why this was suspected is not stated. Like the month of January, February's first fatal air disaster would occur within hours of the new month's beginning. 74 passengers and 6 crew would board a Tupolev TU-134 in Minsk. The Soviet airliner was bound for Leningrad. The aircraft had been sitting out in the open at Minsk for about a week prior to the flight. The jet took off from runway 13 shortly before 8 in the morning. Within 6 seconds of takeoff, the left engine began to lose power. A minute later, while passing through 220 meters, or 722 feet, the right engine would flame out. The aircraft was now without power, and the pilots were forced to attempt an emergency landing in a forest east of the airport. The aircraft would crash and catch fire on impact. It took over 3 hours for authorities to locate the crash site, where 58 of the 80 occupants had already died. It would be determined that the cause of the crash was a large quantity of ice being ingested into the engines. While sitting on the apron, the jet collected a massive quantity of ice on its wings. Neither the airport officials nor the pilots had the aircraft de-iced prior to the flight on February 1st. As the aircraft took to the air, the ice was dislodged from the wings and sucked into the engines, causing both to flame out. February 19th would bring the deadliest accident of the year so far. Iberia Flight 610 would depart Madrid for Bilbao at 8:47 local time, with 7 crew and 141 passengers on board. The Boeing 727-200, named Alhambra de Granada, was scheduled to arrive at 9:35. During June and July of 1984, a pilot strike had occurred at Iberia. Among the striking pilots was the flight's captain. As a result of the strike, the contracts of many pilots had been cancelled, including his. He had later been rehired by the airline. The aircraft would contact controllers in Bilbao at 9:16, while descending through 13,000 feet. The crew were offered a shortcut to the final approach fix, but the crew declined the offer, choosing to fly the standard approach for runway 30. At 9:17, the crew were directed to advise the controller when they arrived over the VOR, marking the final approach fix. At 9:22, the crew reported that they were over the VOR at 7,000 feet and were beginning the maneuver to line up with the runway.
Too low, terrain. Too low, gear. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Nothing more was heard from Flight 610. Weather was poor, with thick clouds located below 8,000 feet. Around 10 o'clock, the aircraft was reported to have crashed on a mountain about 28 kilometers from the airport. Flight 610 had struck a TV tower located atop the mountain at 9:27, while flying at an altitude of approximately 3,450 feet. The collision had sliced off the aircraft's left wing, and it would crash seconds later, killing all 148 people on board. Analysis of the CVR would find that the captain had been strangely quiet and inactive after 9 a.m., passing much of the responsibility of flying the airliner to the first officer. The rejection of the shortcut appears to have been done at the direction of the captain. At 9:25, the crew began a descent from 5,000 feet to the minimum sector altitude of 4,300 feet. This new altitude was set in the aircraft's altitude alert system. This system emits chimes whenever the aircraft is approaching or leaving its desired altitude. The system has two modes. Approach mode indicates when the aircraft is nearing the desired altitude and emits a chime 900 feet prior to reaching it. Deviation mode emits a chime when the aircraft is 300 feet above or below the desired altitude. The chimes used by both modes are identical. In the context of Flight 610 descending to 4,300 feet, approach mode would activate at 5,200 feet and deviation mode would activate at 4,000 feet. As the aircraft started its descent at 5,000 feet, the approach mode chime would not activate. The first officer would fail to notice as the aircraft descended through 4,300 feet, as he was too busy preparing the approach without the captain's assistance. When the deviation chime was heard, the crew assumed that it was the approach mode chime, meaning that the crew believed they were nearing 4,300 feet rather than descending below it. The autopilot had an altitude hold setting. When armed by the crew, the autopilot would maintain the set altitude after reaching it. The system needed to be manually armed by the crew in order for it to function. It is believed that one of the crew members either forgot to activate the system or inadvertently switched it off. Personally, having flown the Boeing 727 and X-Plane 11 for a long while, the altitude selector arm button is a very easy thing to forget, especially during busier phases of flight. The aircraft would continue to descend until striking the TV tower at 9:27. Contributing factor was the style of altimeter used in the aircraft. Drum and needle altimeters are harder to read, and pilots using them will misinterpret data at a far higher rate than other designs, making crew coordination and attentiveness crucial in identifying any misreadings of the altimeter. As the captain was not properly fulfilling his duties, he evidently failed to notice the aircraft dropping below the minimum altitude. It is believed that the reason for his lack of action towards the end of the flight was related to his previous firing by Iberia. He was doing as little work as possible and deliberately selected a longer approach when a shortcut was available to protest his treatment. On February 22nd, an AN-24 belonging to Air Mali was performing a series of flights between Gao and Bamako, Mali's capital city. The aircraft departed Timbuktu with 6 crew and 46 passengers on board. 2 minutes after takeoff, one of the engines failed. The crew announced their intention to return to the airport. When turning back towards the airport, however, the aircraft stalled and crashed 3 kilometers away from where it had taken off. Only a single passenger would survive with serious injuries. The cause of the engine failure was apparently never determined. The following day, a rather bizarre hijacking would occur in Lebanon. An unknown Middle East Airlines Boeing 707 was being prepared to depart Beirut for Paris when an airport security guard named Doriad Hassan stormed the aircraft. The information on what happens afterwards is contradictory. According to the ASN, Hassan was armed with a handgun and 23 hand grenades. He would demand that the 104 passengers exit the aircraft using the emergency slides. This evacuation was assisted by local army and militia forces, apparently looking to evacuate members who were on board the aircraft. At some point, a shootout began between the hijacker and the military forces. A fuel tank was punctured during the fight. The guard ordered the flight crew to increase power on the engines while passengers were still evacuated. At least 14 passengers were caught by the jet blast and injured, with 1 receiving fatal injuries. According to the New York Times, the evacuation was directed by the cabin crew after some sort of shootout began shortly after Hassan stormed the aircraft. 7 passengers were injured during the evacuation, while a male passenger was, quote, sucked out of the open door as the plane took off, end quote. Both sources appear to agree on what happened after the aircraft left Beirut. Hassan forced the aircraft to fly to Larnaca, Cyprus. Hassan had demanded that he and his fellow airport guards be given promotions, pay raises, and better equipment. He would threaten to fly the aircraft into the presidential palace if his demands were not met. For the duration of the flight, the escape slides and doors were open. Eventually, Lebanese authorities would give in to Hassan's demands, and he would allow the aircraft to return to Beirut. The aircraft would land twice at Beirut and once at Larnaca during the ordeal. After landing at Beirut for the final time, the ASN and NYT would differ on the ending of the hijacking. According to the ASN, Hassan was given a car by authorities and allowed to leave the airport without being arrested. According to the New York Times, Hassan had somehow managed to disappear into a nearby shantytown. In both accounts, it would appear as though he had managed to escape justice. On February 25th, a U.S. Air Force Boeing RC-135 named Rivet Dandy would depart Ilsen Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Alaska for a training mission. The 3 crewmen on board would take the aircraft to Valdez, where they would perform a series of practice approaches before returning to Ilsen. Valdez is a coastal town mostly surrounded by mountains. Visibility was apparently poor at the time. 2 practice approaches were performed without incident. During the 3rd approach, coming in from the east, Rivet Dandy would go missing. Search and rescue operations would be quickly launched, but failed to locate the aircraft. Searches would be abandoned after a few days. The wreck would be found several months later, but we will discuss the case further then. On March 17th, an unidentified Saudi Arabian Airlines 737-200 carrying 21 crew members and 76 passengers was flying from Jeddah to Kuwait City with a stopover in Riyadh. While the aircraft was approaching Riyadh, a male passenger armed with a hand grenade hijacked the aircraft, demanding that it be flown to another unspecified location. The crew insisted upon landing at Dhahran to refuel before continuing on to the unknown destination. Once on the ground, the hijacker allowed all on board except for the 2 pilots to leave the aircraft. After he refused to surrender to Saudi authorities, the jet was stormed. The hijacker threw the grenade, which apparently failed to do any significant damage. The hijacker was then fatally shot. The aircraft only suffered minor damage. Very little information is given regarding this case. The motivation or desired destination of the hijacker is not given. On March 28th, the nation of Colombia would be rocked by yet another fatal air disaster. A Fokker 28 belonging to Satena would depart Bogota in the early morning with 6 crew and 40 passengers on board. The aircraft was headed to Florencia with a couple of stops in between. During the short hop from San Vicente, the crew were informed that visibility at Florencia had dropped below minimums. The airport there was subsequently closed. The crew decided to attempt a landing regardless. At around 9:50 in the morning, during the approach, the aircraft slammed into a mountain 15 kilometers north of the airport. All 46 people on board were killed. Unsurprisingly, the cause was determined to be a controlled flight into terrain due to extremely poor visibility, similar to Ares Flight 585 and ACE's Flight 052 back in January. April 1st of 1985 would mark the 61st anniversary of the creation of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Taking part in the celebration were aircraft stationed at CFB Edmonton, located north of the city of the same name. The festivities would include a flyover by a trio of RCAF C-130 Hercules aircraft. As the formation of aircraft approached the base, the wings of 2 aircraft, call signs Trucker 1 and Trucker 2, would come into contact. Both aircraft would subsequently plummet to the ground. Debris would be spread across a 4-kilometer area. A warehouse located inside the airbase would be destroyed by one of the aircraft. The falling aircraft and subsequent fires would narrowly avoid a pair of nearby fuel storage tanks. By good fortune, the wind would blow the flames away from the tanks, averting a much greater disaster. All 10 occupants of both aircraft were killed. There were no fatalities on the ground. There is very little information provided on the case, and no cause is provided. April's first fatal crash would occur on the 11th. A BAE 125 belonging to YPF, an Argentinian state-owned oil company, departed San Miguel de Tucumán at an unknown time. The aircraft was making a short flight to the city of Salta, a little over 200 kilometers to the north, with 7 on board. By the time the aircraft began the approach to Salta, storms had moved into the area. Visibility would drop below minimums during the approach, and a landing attempt would have to be aborted. Despite this, the crew did not follow the instrument approach procedure. The aircraft would fly into a mountain around 30 kilometers southwest of the airport, killing all on board. The cause was determined to be the result of a controlled flight into terrain due to poor visibility. Four days later, on the 15th, a Thai Airways 737-200 was making an evening flight from Bangkok to Phuket. The aircraft was almost entirely empty, with only 7 crew and 4 passengers on board. The aircraft began the descent into Phuket at night in decent weather. 4 minutes after being cleared to descend to 3,000 feet, the crew reported that they were unable to receive the DME signal from Phuket. The crew were offered a VOR approach to runway 09. They rejected this in favor of a visual approach to runway 27, presumably due to the issues with the DME. During the approach, the 737 crashed into a hill at 800 feet, around 18 kilometers from the airport, killing all on board. The accident was caused by the crew's decision to descend below the minimum descent altitude. Or, at least, that is the narrative presented by the Bureau of Aircraft Accidents Archives. The Aviation Safety Network presents a different and much stranger series of events. The narrative is the same until after the crew requested a visual approach to runway 27 at 11:24 p.m. Minutes afterwards, the crew reported that they had lost both engines while passing through 3,400 feet and had narrowly avoided a mountain. The aircraft crashed around 11:30 p.m. No cause is given for the accident. Dual engine failure mid-flight is a rare occurrence in jet airliners. Nothing is said that indicates a long holding time or in-flight delay, pointing away from fuel exhaustion, the most obvious cause for a dual engine failure. For a case involving a civilian airliner in the 1980s, this accident as a whole has surprisingly little information given, especially considering the conflicting narratives presented. I hope you enjoyed the video. I expect this will likely be the last video I make for this year, as I'll be busy finishing some Christmas presents and other work prior to the end of the year. I'm hoping that the next part of this video will come out sometime in January, but given the likely length of that video, I'm not entirely confident in that. I was able to make decent progress on the next set of videos, as now I've completed the 5th and 6th aircraft's exteriors, meaning that all I need to do now for them is complete the interiors, and then they're ready to be printed and painted. Before the end of the year, I hope to have 3 of the 6 aircraft painted and deckled, ready to go, and once I finish up with this video, I will be getting started on creating the decal sheet for the next set of aircraft, which is a sizable but very important step in creating the next set of aircraft. But for now, I'll wish you a premature Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.